Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really fortunate to be bringing you a lockdown conversation with someone whose work has been hugely influential on me so far and my decision to pursue journalism. Tim Marshall is a journalist, author and analyst, and a leading authority on geopolitics and international relations. He was a foreign correspondent and the diplomatic editor at Sky News with 30 years of experience, covering current affairs and conflicts around the world, notably his time in Yugoslavia and across the Middle East. Tim has penned 5 books, including the Sunday Times bestseller Prisoners of Geography, Shadowplay, Behind the Lines and Under Fire, which is Tim's personal account of his reporting from former Yugoslavia and Kosovo during the 90s conflict, Worth Dying for The Power and Politics of Flags, and most recently Divided, Why We Are Living in an Age of Wars. Tim is also the founder and editor of the whatandthewhy.com. So Tim, let me just start by saying, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today. You're a very busy man, and very kind of you to squeeze me in.
Not quite so busy at the moment, but yeah, I mean, there's still stuff going on, but thank you for the invitation.
No problem at all. So before we get stuck in, how have you been finding the lockdown period? How are you?
I'm better off than many people for a number of reasons. Got a garden, got a house, I'm a keen cyclist. Solitary exercise that I can do. And also that I quit full-time work 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And I've been essentially working pretty much from home and an office, which used to be a cafe. And then I moved into an office. So, in that respect, it hasn't changed that much. And obviously, it's a problem not seeing family. Seriously, the biggest thing for me is not being able to go to the football.
Yeah, of course.
I'm a home and away season ticket holder at Leeds United, and that's in the great scheme of things, that's a pretty easy lockdown. We've all got a level of anxiety. I do have a lung condition. I'm sorry to burden you with my medical prognoses. I do have a lung condition, so I am at slightly higher risk. So I have been, a little bit nervous. I've been abiding by the rules. Yeah. But, as for an experience, I spend several hours a day writing anyway, whether there's a lockdown or not.
So, I mean, the pandemic, obviously, it's very strange times at the moment. It's going to have an effect, and in some instances, it already has on societies around the world.
Yes.
I was keen to get your take on what you think the long-lasting effect of COVID will be, especially on the idea of borders around the world. How do you think it's going to affect?
Well, on the wider issue, you have to look at it both at macro and micro, and also short-term and long-term. Now, micro and short-term, all sorts of knock-on effects. Working from home will become more acceptable.
Yeah.
Hopefully washing our hands will do better and more often. Politics, within 18 months, there will be the reckoning across all the countries. I mean, Macron's in deep trouble at the moment. Our Prime Minister is wobbling a little bit.
Yeah.
Bolsonaro in Brazil is having a very bad COVID. Putin, etc. So all these things over the next 18 months will play out, and COVID-19 will have a big effect on them. That's at the short-term micro level. But if you zoom out and look at what I regard as the macro long-term, and let's say long-term, make your own definition, but let's say 10 years onwards, I don't think COVID-19 has very much of an effect at all, which is an unpopular opinion.
Yeah.
Because I'm reading article after article, the world will never be the same again. My starting point is 1919 and the Spanish flu, where even the second wave and total was 100 million deaths, which, God willing, we're not going to even approach in this. And so my question to people who think it is going to have a massive effect is, what was the effect on world history of 1918, 1919? And I think the answer is very, very little. If you look at what was going on around it, end of the First World War, end of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, German stab in the back theory, Ottoman Empire collapsing, etc., etc. All the things that flowed through history in the 20s and 30s flowed from those things, not from the flu. And so, while I do think, obviously, that there's going to be changes, I think if you're looking at the big picture, I don't see how this changes the trajectory of the US-China 21st century relationship. I think it accelerates it. I think it magnifies it. But I don't see anything that is a fundamental likelihood of change.
Well, we will cover COVID a little bit more. I mean, we could talk about that all day. I'm absolutely sure. But before we go into the now, I'd like to take you back a little bit to the beginning of your career. So your career today, I mean, it's a fascinating career today. From what I've read, your route into journalism is also quite interesting as well. You describe it as via the road less travelled. So I just wondered if you could talk me through a little bit more about how you got into journalism.
Yeah, I mean, a bit of background. I'd left school. I'd been invited to leave school when I was 16. I was a painter and decorator, bits and bobs, this and that, a few years in the forces. But I was always a voracious reader and keen in ideas and stuff and history and blah. And I'd always wanted to be a journalist, but it just was not the sort of thing that people like me did. So I didn't. But as you become an adult in the early 20s, you start to get more confidence and think, well, maybe there are routes through. In those days, you could study at night school for free, which I did. Mm-hmm. And on the strength of 1 O-level at night school, I got into college. And again, in those days, you got a full grant. So, now someone like myself might be thinking, do I really want to run up 50 grand? Although student debt is, it's not as bad as a lot of people think. Yeah. Well, for various reasons. We don't want to go into that. So I was lucky, and I managed to get into journalism via doing basically night shifts, doing the train cancellations at LBC. Mm. But it was a lucky break. I was doing a French conversation course at night school, also for free. And I bumped into someone that worked at LBC IRN, gave them my very badly typed CV, no doubt had spelling mistakes and stuff in it. And thank goodness somebody said, well, bring them in, give them 3 days trial. Yeah. And I was quite good at collating train times cancellations and giving them to people. And that was it from there.
And that was the start. So as you say, it was something that you'd always wanted to pursue, but hadn't quite had the confidence to do.
Well, yeah, I'd just never gone down that road. I'd left school at 16. Yeah. I'd gone on the building sites. I'd gone into the forces. It just wasn't. It just wasn't in my scope, vision, parameter.
Well, was there perhaps like a pivotal moment where you decided actually this is something that I can do? Was there a moment, or was it just something that kind of fell into place?
I think it's when I got to college, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to other people, but then I just realised that, hang on a minute, these aren't all geniuses, genii, whatever the plural of genius is. It was a bit of a scales falling from my eyes. And I think that gave me a boost of confidence. I ended up doing a year in America, and there I found it so easy. And this is not because of my brain power; it's because their basic education system, I think, well, it's different to ours. You do modules. You don't do like 3 years on one subject. Part of my degree was in dance. I was doing modern history, and anyway, and I used to, at the beginning of each term, we would get all our essays, and I used to knock them out in a week, stick them in a drawer, and then I used to go around the States delivering cars and getting paid for it and seeing America. And then I'd come back at the end of the term, deliver my essays, and I thought, well, I can do this, and there's all sorts of things I can do. So you learn as you get older.
As you kind of alluded to, nowadays it seems like the modern trajectory of people getting into the industry would be to go to university, placements, and eventually an entry-level role. That's not the route that I've taken as yet. I don't rule it out. I'm 26. I haven't gone down that road yet, but who knows? I'm still in the early stages of trying to develop a career from scratch. But would you say there's any disadvantage or advantage to both approaches?
Well, let me take it through. Even when I went in, and LBC was on Fleet Street, in the great days of Fleet Street, there were all sorts of entries in. They let all sorts of rogues in. They let all sorts of chancers in. They let all sorts of the top public school Oxbridge people in. They let the Barrow boys in who came through. All sorts of people came through journalism and made a success of it. And I was right at the very tail end of that. And then, especially in the 90s, you had to have a degree, preferably from a good university, and probably a year's at a journalism college. Now, I understand that it gives you a good basis of education, good writing skills. you know the basics through your year's course. But what it's done is squeeze out all the other categories of people. And I thought journalism was richer for it. And we've had that for 20 years. And I do think journalism, especially broadcast journalism, is absolutely dominated now by the people from the better universities. And I think that's a weakness, because I don't think the newsrooms necessarily are populated by the people that they are reporting to, the audience.
Yeah.
Although lots of people have made great efforts to try and redress that balance, and BBC, Sky, and others have done that. Which brings me to you. What's really fascinating about the last 5 years with the acceleration of social media, blogging, and the fact we now have the ability to do this. You have the ability to learn the skills, do this, somehow record it and edit it, put it out there to X number of people. Now, I assume it will be, it won't be in the hundreds of thousands, but you're working. This opportunity has never been there before. So I'm hoping, and we're already seeing people coming through blogging. I mean, Martin Lewis perhaps is an example who set up Money Saving Experts.
Yes, yeah.
It's a household name now. But he used this technology and he's become a very well-known financial journalist. I mean, I don't know what he did before. He may have been more before. I don't think he was. So there is now this new route, but I do think that it should still have more scope for people from all sorts of backgrounds coming through. But it has become, especially in broadcasting, much more elite than it was. But in that respect, it's followed the American model, because it happened to the Americans in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
So I will come back to a little bit more about kind of where I am with journalism a little bit later on. Just talking about your career today, you were involved in working around the world in conflict zones as a frontline reporter for roughly 30 years or so. In that time, you would have covered multiple locations, conflicts around the world, as I say. How have you seen the role of a foreign correspondent change in that time?
I don't know if you're aware of Scoop by Evelyn Waugh.
Yes,
brilliant book, which any aspiring journalist should definitely read. In that respect, in the respect of Scoop and Evelyn Waugh, it hasn't changed at all. Obviously, the technology has changed. I hope the ethics have changed. I really do think that I think there are fewer corners cut in mainstream journalism now than there was until maybe only 10 years ago. There was an awful lot of corners cut. I tried never to cut any. I tried never to, always to be as honest as I could. I may not have always done it. It's hard to know, because it's for others to judge. It's changed in the speed. It's changed in the technology, which of course is to do with the speed. You're not sending film back anymore, which would have to be driven for 8 hours, go through customs, be flown back home. When I first came in, there were ITN journalists who would tell me daring do stories of filming something. About 8 days later, it was on air. Whereas now it would be on air the same night. So that's changed, and the storytelling has changed because of it. Because in those days, you would have to tell your story in a wider sense, because things might have moved on in those 8 days. Whereas now you can say this right here happened, because then you can update it just a few hours later. So it's changed in that respect, and that changes the storytelling. I don't think storytelling is as prevalent as it was. There are fewer great storytellers, and the reason is we don't tell stories as much. I mean, journalism really is once upon a time, but hopefully factual, not made up. This happened, this is why, you're taken through on a story. Now, live in broadcast is king. So there's just less storytelling through pictures, through sound if it's radio. And I think that's a detriment. The pendulum will swing back eventually, but at the moment, the stars are those that can go live and explain things. Whereas before, the big hitters were often the great storytellers. Martin Bell, great storyteller.
I was going to say,
brilliant storyteller.
In respects to things being, live broadcast being, as you say, king, do you think in some respects sometimes they do miss the point, i.e. it's there's here's what's going on, it's a very short snippet of news in a broadcast. You're not necessarily getting the full story of someone who's been embedded in a country for weeks at a time.
Yes, very much. And again, you know, when you had more time, you could go into it in more depth, because even if you were only doing 2 minutes, which is from memory, 300 words, not very many words. So be carefully and make sure they go with the picture and they don't repeat the picture, but they complement it, all that sort of thing. You had more time, you had more expertise, I think. And then in the 90s, through satellite, you did get into this thing where you might be chained to a balcony, or you might be allowed out for 3 hours to try and quickly get a story, put it together, put it on air, and then be on the balcony again. And one of the ways to get around that was to send 2 people, you know, 1 balcony, 1 report, and hopefully you would mix and match. What you do now get, though, is with the live, you don't get the storytelling through pictures, and you tend to get a real concentration on process. I mean, but it's a skill, though. It's a skill, this live broadcasting. And the good people can still make it accessible and human, and learn not to use the language of the high priests of politics and economics and journalism, and actually just speak in English.
Yeah.
But I mean, look, don't let any journalist of my age tell you that you've missed the golden age of journalism, because it's not true. Because they are all, even in wars, the 20s was the golden age, the 50s with film golden age, 80s, you know, they've all been golden ages, so don't be put off by old gits telling you that it's past.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess another thing with the actual role, so to speak, the life of certainly a foreign correspondent, there's an element of glamour which is quite attractive to young journalists who are going in, the globe-trotting element, obviously, but it's worth remembering that they're not holiday destinations. So I was just wondering if you could talk through to a little more of the realities and the misconceptions that people might have entering.
Yeah, I mean, there is a glamour attached to it, which is both right and wrong. I mean, war is not glamorous, but it's very hard to talk about this because I'm not sure I've got the language to describe it. But it's not glamorous, but it is exciting, and excitement is considered to have a glamour. But you know, behind that facade, it's horrible and dirty and dangerous, and you're in a better position than nearly everybody around you anyway, because you know you've got medical kit and someone will fly you home and all that sort of stuff. So it's not glamorous, but it is exciting at times. But in the heyday of when I was out and about, when you went through Beirut airport, you had 15 flight cases with you. There's nothing glamorous about arriving at an airport at 1 o'clock in the morning with 15 flight cases and 3 bored customs officers who, if they're not corrupt, will just enliven themselves for 3 hours by making life harder.
Making it difficult.
If they are corrupt, do exactly the same thing and expect $100 as an import tax, as you might politely put it. Is there a tax on this that might help it get through, sir? Not that I ever did that. So that's not glamorous. Nor is driving 16 hours across the desert, hot, bothered, bored, frightened because the driver's clearly fallen asleep. And then when you're just some stupid foreigner when you've shown up in these places, and who's this bloke? I mean, you think, you know, I'm from Sky News and I'm one of their top reporters, and and they're thinking, who's this bloke?
Who is this?
Bloke. And that's what everyone is thinking about you. And then you've got the cameraman, camera woman, the camera person, and the legendary Jerry Williams of Sky News, one of the first cameramen, one of the leading cameramen of the first couple of generations. His mantra was, "Reporters, I wouldn't feed the bastards." You know, it's just this gob on a stick to them. So the problem is that every now and again there are some reporters that really do think the story is about them. And they give their other people a bad name. It's not glamorous.
I think that leads in quite nicely, quite a nice segue into a couple of questions I had about like safety whilst working in environments like that. I mean, some of the places that you will have covered would undoubtedly have been very dangerous. As you say, exciting, no doubt, but not glamorous. And I can imagine it weighs quite heavy on the mind at times. Have there ever been points in your career where you've had to question what your presence is and what you're doing in one of these locations?
I never had that issue about are we making things worse. There's a very good discussion to be had around it. I never went through that. I went through several experiences of thinking, you know, am I helping? I mean, is it your job to help, or just simply to report? There is a thing where you just put a lot of emotion to one side, and it can make you seem quite callous. But there's no point in you breaking down in tears while you're trying to do a job. It doesn't help anybody. Them, you, the audience, nothing. So don't be so self-indulgent. But there were a few occasions, and there's one that sticks in my mind, and it's only for me a minor incident, but for the people involved, a major incident, obviously. There was a woman in a hospital. Her daughter was dying. She was in Baghdad. And in came this, rich, powerful foreigner, me, and she begged me to save her daughter's life because she was clutching at any straw that came past, and this person might have some influence. I mean, I couldn't do anything. So, you do have experiences like that. And the last part of your question, the reason I stopped going to Syria was, I think it was my 5th trip. I'd had a couple of pretty narrow escapes. A friend had been shot dead in Egypt, and nearly got kidnapped. All sorts of stuff happened. But what really did it was, I just thought, I've seen this story before. I know how this story ends because I've covered X, Y, and Z conflicts. And I realized that for me, this was just another conflict. But for the people in it, this was brand new. And this was their entire lives falling apart. And I just thought, if you're going to be that jaded, I don't think you should be here. And I never went back.
Fair enough. I mean, much has been made of the safety of. I mean, obviously, it's more dangerous, obviously, for the people that are stuck in locations, the locals. But as journalists, obviously, the safety element has been highlighted by certainly in Syria, Islamic State, and some of the grisly propaganda videos. I'm sure you're familiar with the orange jumpsuits.
That was a game changer. Yeah, that really was a game changer.
I mean, with that in mind, for someone who's new to the industry, especially freelancers who are potentially thinking about taking themselves or putting themselves in those situations, don't do it. Simple as that.
Many journalists go into situations not fully understanding them. Most of us, but if you're a freelance and with no experience, you really don't know who you are. You don't know where you are, and when you don't know where you are, you can get lost very easily. The example's not a good one. I ought to know his name, but I remember there was this young guy showed up in Baghdad about 4 or 5 days after the statue came down of Saddam, and this could have happened to anyone. But we used to go out with security teams, not armed, but security teams, and while you're doing your job, they'd be just checking everything out, just looking around, and if the crowd was getting a bit iffy, they'd say, I think it's time to wrap up now. There was this one young guy, we'd met him a couple of times, nice young guy. He'd gone out to make his name in journalism, and he was in some crowd. It was just at the beginning when people were realising, hang on, this isn't over. Some guy just came up to him in the back of the crowd, shot him in the back of the neck, and walked off. And that was him. Done. Now, it could have happened to anyone, but he might have had a better chance if he'd been with a team. So let me, again, go back to the beginning of my generation. The Bosnian War was the game changer. When journalists began to be targeted, it was much rarer up to that point. And I put this together with satellite television because for the first time, the people in the war zone could actually watch the reports that you were making about their war zone and obviously see it through the prism of their own eyes. And so even if they weren't watching, let's say, Sky News, the local television were picking up our reports and putting them on their television with translations, which weren't always accurate. And people became targets, different organizations became hate figures, and they began to be much more targeted. And so in came things like pooling. Okay, one camera's going out with 3 reporters, so everyone can do a piece to camera, but there's no point in sending three camera people out there to be shot at. So we just send the reporters out there. Body armor, hard-skinned vehicles, all that stuff came in. And then afterwards came in the training where you'd go off for 3 days with some ex-Royal Marines and have a bag put over your head and pretend to be drowned or whatever, and first aid. So that went on. But the game changer you mentioned was the idea that you wouldn't just get killed in a war zone horribly. You would now be in a jumpsuit with your family watching. And that was a game changer. And when that started happening, you saw fewer people going, And I mean, I used to cross the lines in Syria. I used to go from Syrian army positions across to the other positions, and in retrospect, some of them were incredibly dodgy. They weren't just rebel fighters, you know, they were the real dodgies. And that just stopped. And so that changed the ability to report. So yeah, huge, you know, bookending my career, I think, were two very big changes. I'm sure there were other ones, but those are the ones that to me stick out.
Yeah. I mean, just to finish off on that point there, I mean, what would you say are the most common mistakes that you've seen journalists make in these hostile locations? What are the common faux pas that people get wrong?
I don't say none of it's common, but a common mistake, because it's been done and therefore it's a mistake, is to push too far.
Right.
Just to think, well, you know, when you've got enough, go. Or if you think this doesn't feel right, go.
I remember staying too long and, you know, missing.
In Kosovo in '99, we were a long way ahead of the pack many times for boasting. Not now to me, but to a guy called Yacha Kekic, who took care of me over there. And we were on some exclusive or other, and we were ahead of everybody. And we were driving down this country lane, and for whatever reason, Yacha just said, "Don't like it." And we turned around, and I was it. You know, you don't like it, we don't like it. I have no idea what was down the end of the lane. Not really the point. The point is we had that confidence in each other. And there are sometimes more reporters that say, "No, let's keep going, and that does get people into trouble. So that's. I'm not saying it's a common mistake that's made frequently, but whenever it's made, that is a mistake that is commonly made.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. God knows how I ever had a career in journalism. I can't speak. I'm trying to think of some other ones. Thinking you understand the situation, perhaps to a greater degree than you actually do. Understand the real complexities and understanding who it is that you're talking to, because sometimes people will just put people on. They don't really know who it is that they're talking to. So I think that is a common mistake. I'll give you an example. It's a favourite one of mine. Get off the plane in Tehran, go up to North Tehran University, find a young English-speaking woman with her headscarf pushed back, speaks to you in English, in a language you understand. I don't just mean English. I mean, we want democracy, we want this. And then put it on air as the voice of the Iranian youth. That sort of mistake, I think, is common. Right. That is a snapshot of a student population in the capital city. That is not the Iranian youth. I think that is a common mistake.
Just moving on just to a little bit more of your work. I mean, as you say, you're no longer involved in the frontline aspect of journalism. You've moved more into writing and analysis. I'd just like to talk a little bit more. As I say, you've penned 4 books relating to geopolitics and international relations, including Prisoners of Geography, 10 Maps That Tell You Everything You Need to Know About Global Politics. So that was a Sunday Times bestseller. In my opinion, it was really well written, very clear and concise.
Thank you.
I thought what was excellent was it really lent itself well to explaining the concept of geopolitics in an accessible way. How important was that when you wrote the book?
Oh, it was front and center.
Yeah.
I remember shouting at the television, "It comes to us all, give it a few years and you may do the same." One day I was watching BBC News and the guy, economics person, talked about laissez-faire economics. I don't think X percentage of the audience, probably quite a large, knows what laissez-faire economics is. And that doesn't mean they're stupid. It just means that in their lives, you know, French terms about economic policy are not part of their vocabulary. And you should know that and not use laissez-faire economics. So I wanted to try to talk about this geopolitical view of the world, which isn't just geography, but for me, geography is central to it, as a way of explaining things in order to demystify some of it, because people think that foreign news, you know, is hard or difficult, but of course it isn't. So yeah, it was front and center to try to write with some clarity, to try and explain all these big concepts. But you know, you don't need to use the language of the high priests.
Yeah. And something that I've run into quite a lot, I think, in terms of, I think that maybe is a common mistake, is using lofty terminology that not everyone's familiar with. Trying to actually explain the concept of geopolitics. Now, I run into it all the time, especially with family and friends who pull their hair out when I try. I think a lot of people maybe run away from the word, certainly the words geography and politics at the first instance of hearing the words. How would you explain geopolitics in a concise manner to someone who, you know, panics when they hear it?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that people have different definitions of it. But yeah. Mine is that geopolitics is the coming together of politics, demographics, history, geography, and economics. It pulls them all together, but with a focus on how geography has influenced many of those other elements. So, for example, the economics of Saudi Arabia obviously is tied to its geography. There's oil underneath it. Bingo. That, of course, is directly connected to its history and its politics and its movement of peoples and all that. So you just bring them all together whilst focusing, for me, on the geographic element. And it's the big overarching pictures. It's the ability to make educated guesses about what is happening and why it's happening and what will then happen. And an example is Russia. I often use that because I think it's one of the clearest ones. Russia's history and the wars it's been involved in and all the things it's done and its politics are fundamentally tied to its geography. And when you study Russian geopolitics, you can make this educated guess that this is a country which will continue to decline, which will be dangerous as it declines because it will not be happy as it declines, which because of its geography has relied on fossil fuel energy. And as the use of that declines, that will accelerate Russia's decline and exacerbate its existing economic problems. So you can make educated guesses about the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years of what's going to happen in Russia through studying it and putting geography at its center. Or another one, let's bring together history and geography. If you take the view, and I do, that China believes itself to be an inevitable superpower, that it sees the South China Sea as its backyard, and you look at the geography in the South China Sea and you see this line of islands, they call it the 9-line dash, between the great expanse of the Pacific and China in the South China Sea. They have to get past that barrier. When you understand that pretty simple thing by looking at the map, and then you start to factor in, oh, but these are international sea lanes. Oh, the Americans patrol them, saying they'll keep them open for everybody. But the Chinese, who think they are the inevitable power, think they have to clear everybody out of this.
Yeah.
You can make an educated guess worth watching that place.
Yeah. I think that is the more that I've read, the more it begins to make sense when you align five to 10 factors or so. You can start to go, right, I get it now. I'm not sure most people do. I think that's why it's quite an interesting conversation to have. You released a repurposed version of the book, which was aimed at a younger audience. How important was that? Was it something that you'd always envisaged doing?
No, and in fact, this was a collaborative idea between ourselves and the publishers, Elliott and Thompson, which I think it was sparked by. I relayed a story. A young woman at the Cheltenham Book Festival came up to me and said, oh, I hated geography at school. And I said, me too. And she said, but I'm studying it at Bristol Uni now because I read your book and was inspired. And oh, wow. How cool is that? I mean, that's a great, privilege for someone to say that to you. And that actually happened quite a few times, things like that. So we just thought maybe there's a younger generation that could be inspired in that way.
Yeah.
Beautiful drawings. I mean, it's aimed at sort of 8 to 12, 9 to 13, but a lot of adults say they've pitched at exactly their level, probably being self-deprecatory. And it hasn't set the world on fire, but it's done okay. It's probably up in the 40, 50,000 sales, which is, very, very helpful for a children's educational book.
Excellent. I guess just staying on the concept of geopolitics and talking a little bit more about prisoners of geography. Physical geography obviously presents a whole range of issues and sticking points, be it territorial disputes, borders, access to a resource. How complicated is the analysis of geopolitics made by human geography on either side? So when you start to take into account language, culture, and identity, how much more difficult does that make your job?
I focus so much on the physical landscape and how that then shapes. But I'm not sure, you must forgive me, I'm not sure I've understood the question, because my starting point would be the geography, and because what flows from the geography is the language and the culture.
Yeah.
So I inevitably look at the geography. All right, let's say you're starting from scratch and someone says to you, the Georgian language, it's weird. All their neighbors, their languages are nothing like them. Whereas, of course, if you look at Spain, its language is very similar to French in the wider sense of being Latin-based. And you look at the geography of Georgia and you see how mountainous it is, and then you realize it's this sort of like lake, self-contained lake surrounded by mountains, and that's why everybody in there speaks this language that their neighbors don't speak. Right. And then in the Caucasus, it's the same. You've got about 7 or 8 languages over a place probably the size of the UK. Yeah. And again, it's down to the physical terrain. So to try to answer your question, it hasn't been problematic or confusing because it springs from.
So one explains the other, essentially.
Yeah. And then and ditto with the trade. I'm fascinated I'm bouncing around with the ideas. I'm fascinated with the story about India and China. They have again come to fisticuffs, genuine fisticuffs. Dozens of soldiers are rolling around in the dust somewhere in the Dockland Plateau because they don't agree on exactly where the border would be. They've only ever had one minor skirmish in the 1970s, despite being these two massive powers neighboured. They've got completely different languages. Obviously, India has many. There's been very little trade between them. So that human geography of ethnicity, language, commercial trade, all springs from the origins of the physical geography of there's a bloody great mountain between them. That's why. So it hasn't. It just flows on from it.
Fair enough. I mean, like one of the examples that I had in mind, kind of thinking about that, would have been maybe if you look at the regional power struggle in the Middle East between, say, Iran and Saudi.
Yeah.
The reason there, obviously, you look at both.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that is a good one because, it is easy just to say, oh, it's a Sunni Shia thing, and some people get cross with you. I actually think it is rooted in that one is a majority Shia, which is Iran, and one is majority Sunni, which is Saudi. But of course, it is more complicated than that, and that is when you have to get into the complexities of the geography of the flat Arab lands of Saudi Arabia, which has resulted in a somewhat different culture than the mountainous and swampy and salt deserts of Iran, which is a much less homogeneous society. A third of them, I think, are Azeris. Only half of them are classic Persians. Yeah, there's Arabs and all sorts. And so the Persian Empire and then the original Islamic Empire, there's this clash of history, which of course has not much to do with Islam and the fact that one is Sunni and Shia, because it is about great power rivalry. But people that say it's nothing to do with Sunni Shia, I think, are missing a large part of the explanation of that particular issue.
Yeah, I think that was the reason I had that in mind, is that as we discussed, like the history of it predates Islam in the region. you've also got the convenient barrier of Iraq between both states, and how that features, both resource rich. So yeah, I think maybe sometimes the Sunni Shia thing, when people brush that aside,
yeah, and again, the complexities of the politics, and religion in this respect is politics, because they're both essentially theocracies. Excuse me. If you are the biggest Sunni power, arguably are they're definitely the biggest Shia power.
Yeah.
Well, the Shia top theocrats believe that that God's plan for the world is Shia's plan. If you believe that, then clearly who should be in charge of Mecca? Not Sunnis.
Yeah.
That view, and therefore Iran would love to dominate, control Mecca. Conversely, the House of Saud thinks it leads the Sunni world, and therefore, yes, they should be the guardians of the two holy places, the custodians of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina. So yeah, absolutely, religion is a big part of that clash, as well as the other things.
I guess leading on from certainly like how big a part religion plays and identity and the cultures that go with them play in regional politics, are there any areas or regions that you find particularly difficult to cover? For example, here I'd point out maybe writing about Israel, for example, and its relationship with Palestine, take into account the West Bank, and at the moment we're talking about annexation of another part of the West Bank. A very hard one to write about or to comment on without annoying someone somewhere. Is there anywhere that's always stood out for you as a tricky one?
Yeah, well,
that one.
I mean, it's tiresome how what I find tiresome about that one is actually just all the outsiders fixating about it and ignoring other things. I just, it's just irritating. Because if you look at any conflict, it's as complicated. It's pretty much as complicated. South Sudan and Sudan, once you start drilling into it, the complexities of that are every bit as complex as Israel and Palestine. And I think it's useful to realize that most people are as unaware of the complexities of Israel-Palestine as they are of Sudan and South Sudan. Well, look, during each conflict, every single one of them is as tasty and as problematic in the eye of the beholder as the Israel-Palestine one. I mean, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia is a classic example. Kosovo, Serbia, classic example. You can say one report and then you'll just wait for people to say, you are so biased for the Serbs. And exactly the same report, other people say, you are so biased in favor of the Serbs. And it's the same report. You think, oh my God. Now, clearly there are people who do write polemics in favor of one or the other, but it's usually quite clear. I'm trying to think of other examples. Oh, Syria, people have just gone off completely pop. And what happens is that people often tend to see whatever the report is by whichever the mainstream journalist who's hopefully trying to be balanced. They see it through their own prism, through their own biases. And if it doesn't conform exactly to them, they make some quite outlandish remarks. And because they tend to see politics, I mean, you could have conflict A, which is between X and Y. And if you explained it to somebody, oh, X is socialist, communist forces, and Z are the fascist forces, and you explained it to them, they will take one side, depending on their view. And if you then said to them, actually, I just made a mistake, it's the other way around, why? You really could do that with people, because they seem to support at one side or the other in an argument based on what they they would be on my side, as opposed to the actual events and facts on the ground.
The context of I mean, I'd say like an example, even in our own country, if you look at Brexit and how divisive that's been, like certainly in my lifetime, I'm only 26, but it's the gulf between left and right at the moment seems absolutely enormous.
That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's not even a left and right issue.
Well,
I mean, all sorts of left-wing stalwarts were completely in favour of Brexit. But you're right about the degree of division and rancor and inability to accept that the other people are arguing in good faith. It's not something we're used to. Sadly, I think it's something we need to become used to, because I'm not sure we're going back to the old days.
Well, I mean, that was I was going to lead on to. I guess trying to build bridges. I mean, with people becoming so polarized, what if anything can be done to bridge that gap, do you think?
People of goodwill can simply carry on trying to be moderate and try to hold the center ground. But the center ground, I mean, that in itself has become a problematic, centrist dad is now a term of abuse, and the center ground is held to be, oh, well, you're partly responsible for the problems because you're not on this side or that side. So each side can, because I am in the center on most issues. I actually think most people are in the center, but they don't bother getting involved in these silly little rows that happen on social media or on this television. They're not really bothered by it. The people that are involved in those rows think that the whole country is caught up in it. They're really not. They're really not. It gives you a very great sense of importance if you think you're at the center of all these things that are happening. No, I think many of us are still in the centre and or prepared to listen, but I do think that social discourse will continue to be polarised. You can only just keep going, and if you want to change the world, you change yourself, or in this case, don't change, carry on in the centre. But no, I don't see us going back. I mean, I heard on the radio this morning of some bloke who's formed the Common Sense Society or something. He seemed a very nice chap, to try to when people are having these horrible, vicious rows, to interject and say, well, actually, if we look at all the evidence and we could examine this in a nice, calm manner, good for him. That's one of the ways you could try and change it. I don't think we will. I think we've entered a new era of politics about you just shore up your base to make sure that it's solid, and then you pick off as many as you can. It's not about bringing people together. It's about having a base and then building on it. These are new times, and I think we have learned an awful lot from that chap in the White House.
Yeah, absolutely. Just bringing you on to I'm just going to talk a little bit about your latest book, Divided While We're Living in an Age of Wars. I'm currently reading it at the moment, very much enjoying it.
Thank you.
You could forgive people for thinking that, in this globalized world, that wars are coming down rather than going up. You make the case quite clearly that this isn't the case. What do you think's leading to that, and why do you think we are more divided?
Yeah, I mean, the narrative was that globalization was flattening the world. There was a book, Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat, 2002, New York Times bestseller. It's not flat. What he means is that people in his social circle can get in a plane and fly over places, and it's all flat. And when they land, there are like-minded people there to go for dinner with, and they can all agree with each other. Forgetting that actually everywhere else, people aren't leading those lives. The world is not flat. And thinking that all these barriers were coming down, whereas in fact what was happening, and it's empirically provable, is that barriers were going up, and increasingly trade barriers, but physical barriers, fences, walls, were going up. And there's now a third of all the countries in the world either have a fence or a wall, and people don't know about them. India completely fencing off Bangladesh, Hungary fencing off anybody it can find, etc., etc. Greece fencing off Turkey, Bulgaria fencing off Turkey. I mean, I could go on around the world. There's 65 countries that have done this.
I think that's the thing that probably I'd say surprises a lot of people. It's the amount of fencing and barriers that are going up, certainly within Europe.
Bangladesh and Myanmar, India and Pakistan. I mean, on and on it goes, all over the world. So what's driven it? I'm pretty confident. You can't really prove these things, but you had a backlash against globalization, which is, I mean, and can end on, come back to COVID at the end of this.
Yeah.
So in the 20th century, the Berlin Wall's come down, communism has collapsed. That boot that suppressed things has been lifted, and from it flows lots and lots of conflicts, which leads to division and borders and fences and walls being built. That's one thing. Coming into that, by 2008, we have the crash, financial crash, where the safety net has been raised and there's more people underneath it because the richer powers are running out of money at exactly the same time as technology is allowing people to try to get to those countries. Technology allows them to see how the rest of the world lives and thinks, I want some of that, and to get there, and to leave the digital breadcrumbs so other people can follow on in their path. And this comes around about the same time as 2008 and some of the fence building and the conflict and global warming, which is driving people movement. And so as people movement gathers pace and the money begins to run out in the richer countries, the fences start to go up everywhere. And then it culminates in 2015 and the million people that arrive in Germany. And Mrs. Merkel made some very bad moves, but seemed to genuinely misread the European population and politicians' mood when she told the 27 other countries, you will take this amount and you will take that amount, and all 27 said, nah.
No, yeah.
Completely misread. And I'm afraid those attitudes are hardening. And we started by talking about the ramifications of COVID. I think one of them, but this is simply, as I said, magnifying and accelerating an existing trend, will be that I'm afraid hearts will harden. No, we don't want people from other countries that might have diseases coming, even whether it's Sweden and Denmark at one level, or whether it's people, crossing from further south. And then as we look forward, again, talking about geopolitics and bringing in things like demographics and geography, if climate change continues to hit the Sahel as hard as it is doing, and those countries, many of which are already in conflicts, if they fail to deal with their issues, I don't see why more people won't move. If Africa's population does double over the next 40 years, which is expected, I don't see why people would stay there when they haven't got a billion extra jobs. And so these things, those movements are going to keep coming. And ask yourself what you think the impact on the richer countries' politics will be. I don't think it will be, let's open our doors and take care of everybody. You can make the argument that you think it should or not. It doesn't really matter. What matters is what will happen. And I'm confident that I'm afraid hearts are going to harden.
Yeah,
on that cheerful note. Sorry.
I recently worked. I covered a little bit about the Sahel. I did an article about the security situation there that's rapidly deteriorating, and it seems like a perfect example of quite a few of the ills that we've spoken about. So you've got a perfect cycle of extremism, a post-colonial legacy of instability. Then you factor in climate change and the effects of COVID is obviously a new one, but the effect that's going to have on driving mass migration. Yeah, I can't help but agree. The outlook,
which is why we ought to be investing both in security there and in sustainable development to a greater degree than we are. And it's extremely unpopular to want to increase the foreign aid budget, but I do.
I think people instinctively assume that walls and barriers are a bad thing. You take the border wall between the US and Mexico, and the vitriol that was met with as an idea. However, there would be others who would propose that walls are sometimes necessary. So if you look at the examples of Northern Ireland, even controversially, even Israel, depending on what side of the walls you're on, what would be your overarching perception of walls, and could you make the argument that they are sometimes required?
Yeah, both. I mean, my starting point is that they're bad, because the reason they are required is negative. It is the story of competition and anxiety about the other. That's the starting point for why the wall then goes up. So they are inherently bad from their starting position. Nevertheless, if you've got to a position where you think one is required, I think you can make the argument that it is required, and at that point is a good thing. Not intrinsically, not inherently a good thing, but a good thing in that it can alleviate an existing problem while you work on that problem. This is the big point. It's no good just sticking up the wall and then throwing the key away, which actually is what the Israelis have done. They've put up walls, Gaza, to a lesser extent, Palestine, and they've just thrown the key away and said, we've had enough of this, and we're behind our wall. It hasn't really dealt with the problem. I'm not saying the problem can be dealt with, but that's what they've done. Trump as well. But there are others, and the Northern Ireland example is a good one, where theoretically the walls have gone up and a lot of people each side of them want them there because they realise without them there would be more trouble than there is, whilst they're working on the issues between them. And when you come to a certain point, you know what, these issues between us no longer require a wall, then you bring it down and then you work to make sure you don't have to bring it back up. So in that respect, they can be a useful tool, but I think they're entirely negative if they're only a tool to hide behind without being used and try and fix the long
as a kind of an us and them kind of tool with fear at the centre. I'm conscious of running out of time, so I've just got one or two questions that I'll quickly glance over. Not to sound like a doom and gloom merchant, with the dominance of COVID-19, obviously that's absolutely dominating the global news agenda at the moment. Are you concerned at all about the stories that are going underreported? And if so, what would you say we should be worried about? What are the things that keep you awake at night, story-wise?
None of them. I sleep fine. I'm very fortunate. But well, we touched on them. The Sahel is really a mess. And there's a terrible amount of suffering down there, and they may now be getting hit by locusts that may be coming across from East Africa as well. That, so I'm just going to look at the map that's in front of me. Population growth, Africa in particular, 1.1 billion now, supposed to be 2.2 billion by 2060. If they cannot create 1 billion jobs, what is the future for the continent? So that's and tied into that is global warming, climate change. Those are the two big ones, I'd say. I mean, you look at a map and I can see, there's 193 countries. I can see 193 problems. But if you're asking for some big headlines, the Sahel and population growth tied to climate change.
And just to finish on, just in terms of going back to borders, I just want to touch on, I've covered recently the tricky topic of borders that exist at sea. How much more difficult does it become to talk about who owns what when you're talking about the oceans? Examples being the Arctic and the scramble for resources up there. It's even talking about water wars, it touches on the concept of going up into the Nile and things like that. How likely do you think it is that we're going to see problems relating to access to salt or freshwater resources in the near future?
There was a book written in I think it was the mid-80s called Water Wars, which is quoted by everybody since that. I don't think there's been one, but I do think despite that 30 years on, it is absolutely still an issue. Syria and Turkey nearly came to blows, I think in the 90s, over it. Ethiopia and Egypt have got some serious differences.
That was the one that stuck out to me.
And in general, I mean, it's funny, in Australia, a lot of countries have arguments, Spain, a lot of countries have arguments with each other about water supplies. In Spain, the different areas have arguments with each other about who should have access to what amount of water that is within Spain. So this is going to carry on, especially if the climate change modelling is correct, and the stresses, which is why, if we can end on a positive note, if AI and all the things that are coming with the new technology can actually desalinate water for free at a mass level, you would immediately de-stress a lot of situations. India, Pakistan, and the headwaters of the river there you would immediately, Israel-Palestine, one of the issues is the aquifers underneath the West Bank, etc., etc. So if you know, things like that are actually possible. You mentioned the Arctic. At the moment, I don't see any prospect of conflict up there. I mean, the Russians are busy arming themselves silly up there in the Arctic, and there are existing bodies to work out some of the issues regarding water. I mean, you know, there's very clear rules about the 200 miles of EEZ, exclusive economic zones, etc. 12 nautical miles, sovereignty off the coast. You know, very, very clear rules. And there is the IMO, the International Maritime Organization in London, which is one of the world bodies set up to regulate these things. So, I mean, you know, you and I have spent an hour chatting about the woe is me of the world, but 'twas ever thus. And, you know, we're going to get over this COVID. We're going to get over an awful lot of the problems that we've discussed, because we've always got over these problems, and we'll probably get over the water problem.
Well, I think that's a positive note to end on there, Tim. So
best to try.
Thank you so much again. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you this afternoon. I've certainly learned a lot listening to you, and I'm sure my viewers will. For everyone who's watched, I can't recommend Tim's work enough. Anyone who's got an interest in the global news agenda and the stories behind them, I can't think of a better starting point than Prisoners of Geography. Tim, thank you once again, and I hope that we'll get a chance to catch up further on in the year in better circumstances.
Thank you, and I wish you luck, and so far so good.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tim. Cheers.
Cheers.